Ladies and gentlemen, damas y caballeros, thank you for joining us for another episode of All the Angles, the Business of Padel podcast worldwide, powered by the Hexagon Cup. This week, our objective is to give you, our audience, a unique insight into the Asian padel market. I'm joined this episode by Ben Nichols, who is the International Communications Lead at the Hexagon Cup, and we are fortunate enough to explore this area with some of the leading club owners in the space. I've got Alan Healy, who is the founder of Padel India. His background is as an investment analyst at Ariseg Partners, so he has experience in investment markets around South Africa and now obviously more recently India. We're also joined by Davy Sanh, who is the CEO of Pop Padel in Singapore. His background is from finance and auditing from companies such as KPMG and the Asian aviation company SATS. And finally, we've got Curtis Yu, who is the co-founder of Padel Plus Hong Kong, who has an engineering and public policy background with Arup, and he's, I think, got a PhD in the works. So we've got a variety of backgrounds, we've got a variety of geographic coverage, and hopefully between those three, we will be able to give our listeners a good oversight of this huge continent. Before we get started, if you enjoy this episode or have benefited from previous ones, please share, subscribe, like, it helps. So without further ado, let's start with a macro view of Asia. And I really want to look at it from three different angles. One is pure population. The numbers are obviously incredibly impressive when you look at the Asian continent. The second angle is a little bit around the demographics of the Asian market and how that's evolving and what that means for padel. And then the third piece of this macro intro is about the racket pedigree that Asia enjoys and how that is going to be critical. So let's start with the population, right? 4.8 billion people live in the Asian continent, which is around, estimates say, around 60% of the global population. But when you look at padel in terms of its spread or its proportion, the Fit World Padel Report talked about 6.4% of the global players, 9% of the professionals. And it's got round about 3,000 to 4,000 padel courts existing today. Most of those, around 85% of those, are in the Middle Eastern piece of Asia. So if we leave Middle East aside, why is it that Asia is kind of playing catch up when it comes to embracing padel? And maybe, Alan, let's start with you.
Yeah. I think it's just a lack of awareness, really. The sport has taken a while to come across here. I remember just growing up as a kid and heading across to Spain on holidays. I must have been there dozens of times, but I hadn't come across the sport. And I think that's the same thing out here. So most people, I admit, in India who have got their exposure to padel, it's been through the Middle East. So as you know, the Crown Prince there posted pics of his new favorite hobby 4 or 5 years ago. And since then, there's just been a flurry of courts that come up there. So that's where the majority of exposure, I think, from an Indian context has come in. But up until that point, it's just a lack of awareness. I think padel's background is very Spanish. You know, even watching it on TV, all the interviews and everything have always been in Spanish. And so that kind of hasn't helped gaining awareness out of the Asian region. But coming to Dubai, that has helped. And now some of the cricket players have started to play. Last year, we had the Cricket World Cup. A lot of the British players were playing in between their matches. They were introducing it to some of the Indian cricket team. Now, quite a few of them have started to play a lot of padel, posting pics of their new hobby. The same is true with Bollywood. So some of the celebrities in Bollywood have now started to play, whether it's here in Mumbai or in Dubai. So awareness is building. So it's just had a bit of a lag relative to the rest of the world, but it started to take off. The largest diaspora of players, you mentioned the Middle East, the largest diaspora of players there are Indians. So as and when they come home, they're starting to looking, maybe opening some courts here, introducing it to friends. You're just posting pics on Instagram of the hobby. It's helping build awareness here. So we're only scratching the surface of where we're going to go, but awareness is slowly starting to build now as more celebrities and famous people are getting into the sport.
What about Singapore's journey, Davey?
Well, in Singapore, I think it has been pretty good in the recent years. I think in general in Asia, what I would say is that obviously the context that we have gone through with COVID had a deep impact. In fact, a lot of countries really picked up paddle during COVID. In the previous episode, you mentioned about Sweden and what happened over there, how really paddle picked up during COVID. Well, those countries which managed to pick up paddle during COVID was because they actually already had some courts that were existing. And so, of course, with the existence of courts, certain people started playing because they couldn't do much, other things. Paddle was one of those activities which was possible to be done. Therefore, there was a very quick demand for more courts, more clubs opening. I think here what happened is that during COVID, there was almost no court. So that's why we couldn't take advantage, so to speak, if we can use that term in the context of COVID, that COVID context to really scale up paddle really quickly. But I think we are really catching up. Secondly, I think it's also about the geographical location of Asia. To build court is actually not cheap. And up until only recently, the only country really where you could find courts that were being manufactured was Spain, if I'm not wrong. Geographically, Asia is actually kind of far from Spain. So I think the cost of importing, getting those courts manufactured in Spain, getting them shipped over, and also having the necessary expertise and skill set locally here to install the courts wasn't easy unless you actually pay a premium to fly people over. So I think the cost was also a barrier, but I think more recently there are more and more, typically in China, manufacturers of paddle courts coming up. And I think the third reason that I can see is, as you mentioned earlier, Asia is very big on racket sports. I recently got the chance to attend the Singapore Smash as part of the World Table Tennis Tour. I was being told that it's the equivalent of Wimbledon for table tennis. I'm not an expert in table tennis, but I went to watch and observe and see how people react. And it was just crazy. I never thought, especially the Chinese fans that were flying over from China, would be so enthusiastic about the sport. And we had legends in town, Ma Long, Wang Shuxin, and people like that. And when I saw that, I was like, okay, it will take a while for paddle to really pick up in a country like China, which is a giant in Asia. So I think there are certain racket sports which are truly embedded in the culture of Asian people. But as much as it may appear as a hindrance, I do see it as an opportunity. And I think we will get the chance to deep dive into that later on. And I think maybe before I pass the mic to Curtis, I think the last point is people in Asia generally, in most countries, are getting more and more wealthy. They have a higher disposable income, higher purchasing power. And I saw a lot of them, in fact, on the recent years, over the past 10, 15 years, picking up tennis, because we just went through the most magnificent era that tennis has ever seen with the big three, big four. And it is seen to be glamorous, to be belonging to a certain social status category, to be able to afford to send your kids to play tennis and all that. And in Asia, I think paddle is still perceived as a sort of subcategory, sub-sport of tennis. So I think from us pioneers in Asia, it's really important to change that mindset and to say that, hey, paddle is not the second sport after tennis. It's a sport entirely on its own, which deserves a lot of credit.
Just love to hear your views. And then I've got a follow up actually, just to come back to you and Davy on from something Alan said earlier.
Yeah, of course. Speaking about Hong Kong, it's being a very small city. It's lagging behind neighboring countries or cities like Singapore, India. We opened our doors last year, and so far with 9 courts in Hong Kong, we've got like 7 million populations. So obviously we're quite behind, but the momentum is getting there. So there are a couple of reasons why I think in Hong Kong or even in Asia that it's not really at the scene. The first one being it's very Spanish sport. For the Premier Paddle, the World Paddle Tour social media was in Spanish. So not a lot of Asian would understand. And also the reels, a lot of them is in Spanish as well. And now there are more and more content in English, and that will definitely help gain more attention to the sport. And the second thing I would say would be Asian cities are very densely populated. I'm sure it's in like Singapore, in India, especially in Hong Kong. So it's very difficult to find land in Hong Kong to build courts and make it accessible. Like even if we have courts, the fee would not be as cheap as a badminton court or a government tennis court because there's government funding behind it. So at the very early stage of paddle, there are certain challenges and would require some financial subsidies from the government in order to make it more popular and more accessible to the community. And what Davy said about paddle as a sub-sport of tennis, speaking to a lot of players, Hong Kong is quite into pickleball because a tennis court can be divided into 2 pickleball courts. And that creates some competitions between paddle and pickleball, and not to mention tennis. So there are certain challenges to make paddle more attractive and more accessible to the wider audience.
I just want to pick up, actually, Curtis, you just addressed one of the questions I was going to ask, which Alan picked up on, is about the Spanish nature of the sport. And obviously a lot of the commentary, a lot of the presentation, a lot of the clips we see are in Spanish, and that's gradually changing, but it's going to take some time. And it seems that might be a slight impediment to its growth in terms of a market like Asia until we see more content in English. But actually, I suppose, Alan, start with you. What do you think are the other factors? You know, you've got a population of 1.4 billion in India now, huge. What are going to be the other aspects that will help it propel in a market like India? We've talked offline about IPL cricketers and Bollywood stars getting involved. If you could pick 4 or 5 key areas that are going to help this sport really thrive, what do you think it will be?
Yeah, I mean, that's the main one. I think celebrities in India are celebrities like nowhere else in the world. They're really loved and adored. And if we start to get a few more of them playing the sport, perhaps endorsing the sport, competing in the sport, that will be the biggest kicker for the growth in terms of awareness and everything else. The other points, which the guys touched on, is trying to drive down the cost of actually setting up a paddle club. So until now, we've been importing courts from Spain. There's a lot of import duties. Thankfully, the last few months, there's some local manufacturers which have come on board. They're now starting to produce decent quality courts at, maybe a 40% discount of what we're getting from Spain. So that's the second one. And the third is also just on the racket side of things. So importing the rackets, duties, everything. We're now seeing Decathlon, one of the French retailer now launching rackets at $50. So all of these kind of pieces together are helping to make the sport more accessible. And then if you have celebrities endorsing the sports, that drives awareness. The real value add, or the real kind of kicker, I think, beyond that, is just at the grassroots level. If we can get the sport into universities, into schools before universities, that's what will help drive the sport become more mainstream. The kids will have access to it like from a young age. And from that, then once you have the grassroots in place, you can do so many different things, from academies, coaching, all the way up to start building talented players. We're in the Olympic season. Eventually, if paddle does one day get into the Olympics, we can, start having some stars there.
And what would you say, Davey, in terms of what's going to help from your side in Singapore? Are you looking at content creation is going to help with influencers via Instagram, helping reach, consumers and get people through the door? Or what are the most useful, I suppose, marketing tools you can use to develop the Singapore market?
Well, you're right. Generally in Asia, and I think Singapore is no exception to that, people are really big on social media. What I have been observing, I'd say in Singapore, but also generally in Southeast Asia, which is fortunately a rather funny part of the world, is a lot of times a synonym of like holidays. So I think for that, what I have seen, how paddle has been evolving here is in clubs like Bali, for example, is paddle has really become in Asia a lifestyle. It's a lot more than just a simple workout. It's really a place for people to go there and to document their journey into sport in paddle. So it's a lifestyle, and a lot of the clubs, in fact, here are also sort of leveraging that by providing a very holistic experience. And a lot of people, not only influencers, I would say, but even people who are just influencers, maybe at the amateur level, they do document a lot their journey in paddle, taking lessons, posting content about their highlights, their matches, and they even do like paddle retreats, for example, in Bali or in Thailand. And of course, the increasing availability of coaches, typically from Spain or from Argentina, and they are coming from obviously very reputable countries, as far as paddle is concerned, is really helpful. So yeah, it has been very encouraging to see how the sport has been picking up.
Curtis, what about from your point of view? What do you think are going to be the key drivers and catalysts for the sport's growth in not just Hong Kong, but that part of the world, in that kind of more northern area of Asia? What are the things that really can level up the speed of how the sport is embraced by the general public?
Yeah. So for the northern part of the Asia, like China and Hong Kong, there are a lot of metropolitan cities like Hong Kong, Shanghai, Chengdu. I think intense marketing is very important. So what we did with Taikoo, Swire Properties, they're one of the biggest property developers in Hong Kong. They built a pop-up court at one of the most iconic office building in Hong Kong in the CBD, and that attracted a lot of people. The collaboration period was from May to July, but because it attracted so many people and we had great feedback, it extended to October. So I believe like with this success story, it can duplicate into different countries. And I know they do the same in Shanghai as well. So we need property developers support. That's very important to make it accessible and feasible as well. And also, as you guys mentioned, influencers, content creation are as important. But from a different point of view, just like F1, the Netflix show Drive to Survive, right? I think a Netflix show will definitely make paddle boom in Asian cities.
If I may just add on, I think with more and more content being posted in English, I think that would be really helpful. And along that line, the Asia Pacific Paddle Tour, APPT, which is a professional tour that has been going around in different cities, they actually did something that I think is really good. They are live streaming their matches with English commentators. And this is great because then it helps to educate people when they watch the games, to understand, what's happening, because otherwise it's pretty difficult to watch a game, a new sport. You don't even know the rules. And if no one is there explaining, you can't keep up with the score. You just don't know what's happening. And you will very soon just move on to watch something else. And then I think the other thing about Asian culture is that they need their heroes. They need their idols in countries like Alan mentioned in India, but typically in South Korea or China or Japan as well. I think this is really crucial for the growth of paddle, for the visibility of the sport online. And I think, if Asia manages to pull out one or two top players in paddle in the next 10 years, I'd say it would be great for people to identify themselves to the sport and to these homegrown heroes.
Curtis, you mentioned this idea of having a high visibility, high footfall location to expose people. That's in every playbook, right? You see that in San Francisco at the Embarcadero, where they put up a pop-up court to really make people see what it is and take notice. In London, we had one in Battersea Park Power Station, which is an incredibly iconic building, but they've just put one up in Marble Arch, which is again also a high footfall location, just to put it right in front of a huge amount of people who would normally probably never see it, just to get that curiosity bubbling away. So I think that playbook that you're talking about in Hong Kong is definitely a very international one. I wanted to jump on one point that I think all three of you mentioned, is this tapping into the new upper middle class, disposable income classes that are growing in Asia. If you look at globally how much the luxury goods markets rely on Asia, on the Asian spend to keep their growth numbers going in the right direction, I'm getting the sense that paddle can tap into that. When you've seen this growth in the last 2 decades up to 2020, East Asia doubled the world's consumers class. And so the proportion of the consumer class and those with disposable income in Asia is just growing at a tremendous rate. That's why they're buying Louis Vuitton. That's why they're buying Gucci. That's why they're buying Balenciaga. But as you mentioned, that's probably also why they're looking at the sports that are indicators to their peers of having disposable cash. There are certain things that indicate, especially in the Instagram world that we live in, that you have a certain amount of disposable income. For paddle, it's an obvious opportunity, right? Because people are going to want to play paddle. They're going to want to be seen to play paddle. They want to advertise and promote that they play paddle, that they have these wonderful rackets, the wonderful clothes, the wonderful club that they are a member of. But is there a risk that positions paddle as almost too exclusive, too elitist? and that as a result, Asia will pigeonhole the sport as a sport for those who have the resources and not as an accessible, community-rich sport which attracts talent, which attracts people from all kinds of demographics. Is there that risk? And if there is, how do you think Asia or the markets in Asia can address that? Curtis, let's start with you.
So yeah, definitely there is a risk of people having the perception of it being an elitist sport or like upper middle class sport. And I think at the very beginning, when the supply isn't that much, and in order for clubs to survive, we have to target this target audience first. And then as the paddle population grows, the demand grows, the supply grows, that we can slowly adjust the price to become cheaper and cheaper. It's all about the supply and demand. And also in Hong Kong, we are trying to make it more accessible by identifying talents and offering them free lessons so that they can compete for us in the tournament. Davy said, the APPC or the APPT. So we're constantly offering classes. And also we do a lot of like community service from 8 to 9:30. We offer free courts to players over 60, and we do kids open class free of charge. And most recently, to make it more accessible, so we're trying to implement different events or different measures to make it more accessible and to cater the wider audience.
Alan, how would you balance that potential perception that paddle could get? I've just come back from the East Coast of the US, where it is picking up a little bit of that elitist perception. And I put it down to a timing thing that as it becomes more mainstream as a sport, there'll be a version of a club for everyone, people from all walks of life. So I think it is a time, supply and demand thing, as Curtis said. But what would you say in India? How are you going to balance your ambitions with making sure it's seen as a sport for all?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a fair one. It is becoming or being associated a bit of elitist here in India as well. I think it's also just that the clubs that are opening courts at the beginning are more of the high-end clubs where the elite hang out. Investing in a paddle court, it is fairly expensive relative to other sports. And coupling that with Davy's point, paddle is more than a sport. It's a lifestyle. And so people are buying that kind of tennis clothes, the paddle clothes, and, going to these clubs and hanging out. I think for the sport as a whole, it runs the risk, but I think it also has positives, right? Because everyone aspires to be like that portion of society, and that's what gives you exposure. To make it mainstream, I think really what will happen is once the government recognizes the sport from a federated level, the government will be obliged to fund the sport, promote the sport nationally, and start getting it into schools, which will help, on some of the state schools across the country and into some of the universities as well. That then gives some of the younger players exposure to the sport from a younger level, perhaps from slightly less privileged backgrounds, and that can help balancing the field a little bit. But today in India, when we speak of 1.5 billion people, there's probably only 50 million people who can afford to play paddle, which is not great. It's a large number, but it could be higher. And so with some of the innovation and onshoring of production and manufacturing and everything else that we're seeing, that's driving down the cost. And I think the real game changer will be if the government gets on board and really starts to promote the sport in schools. That's what will make it a bit more accessible.
And we're recording this obviously during the final days of the Olympic Games. Obviously the question turns towards if or when paddle becomes an Olympic sport. And I think it's particularly interesting given that squash has been admitted to the next games in LA, what that does for kind of other racket sports like paddle and pickleball and their ambitions. Davy, let's start with you. Singapore has a great racket sport history. It's done very well at the Olympics in different sports. What do you think of paddle's chances to get to the Olympic Games? And when do you think that might happen? And what would that do for the growth of the sport in Singapore and the wider Asian region?
Well, I think that's a very good question. We all look forward to having paddle at the Olympics one day. That will be the ultimate goal. I think before that, there are certain steps that we need to go through. In Asia today, you only have, I would say in the eastern part of Asia, you only have a handful of countries which have an official federation that's affiliated under the FIP. So I think those countries are, in fact, if I'm not wrong, China, Japan, Thailand, South Korea, and the Philippines. There are a lot more countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, which don't have a federation yet, at least affiliated under the SIP. And I'm well aware that a lot of the countries, including Singapore itself, are working on that. In Singapore, all the paddle clubs have come together to form the national association with the hope of being affiliated under the SIP one day. And if all these countries do the same, I think it will definitely increase the chances of paddle showing up at the Olympics. I think before that, we also have the Asian Games, the Southeast Asian Games. And I think those steps that we need to achieve so that we gain the legitimacy ultimately to be an Olympic sport. So I think if I may share an example, I can see a lot of attraction in different countries. Currently, we are forming up the national team for Singapore that will be taking part in the APPC, which is the Asia Pacific Paddle Cup. It's actually the equivalent of the Davis Cup for paddle, largely for Asian countries. I know Curtis is doing the same for Hong Kong, and each country is going to send a team composed of 7 males and 5 females, and they will be basically wearing the national uniform and be competing, representing their country to compete against other countries in Asia. So I think, again, this will be another proof that there is growth, there is potential, there are athletes who will be capable. And I think if we can do that in Asia and other parts of the world can do the same, I would be very optimistic for the chances of seeing paddle in the Olympics in maybe 2032.
Curtis and Alan, love to hear your thoughts on the Olympic question as well. Curtis, let's start with you.
Yeah, when paddle gets to Olympic, it will be massive for the paddle industry and for everyone. And as Davy has said, having an affiliated association is the first step that we have to do. And just like Singapore, the 2 clubs in Hong Kong are joining forces to create an association and picking players for the APPC. So I think the APPC actually accelerated the synergy between 2 clubs and combined all the paddle players in Hong Kong to drive the success of it. And another thing is if paddle becomes an Olympic sport, the traction, the popularity will rise, because for Hong Kong parents, they want their kids to go to good universities, get scholarships, and seeing paddle as an Olympic sport, they will push their child to play paddle because it's still a very new sport. The competition is not as high as like traditional sports like swimming or like tennis. So this is another very possible way to make paddle grow as well. So yes, I'm looking forward to see paddle in the Olympics. In fact, Hong Kong's Olympic swimming team came to our club earlier this morning, and we were talking about when paddle will actually become a sport. And they said paddle is very competitive. You can see there are different sports that is gaining the Olympic status, like skateboarding, and it has gained a lot of success. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so India is actually hoping to secure the Olympics in 2036 in Ahmedabad. So fingers crossed that happens, and it would be absolutely beautiful if paddle was admitted to the Olympics by then. As Davy mentioned, 2032 would be nice. I believe it's 7 years before is the cutoff point. So I think next year will be the decision for 2032. I think it might be a little bit too soon. Let's see. I mean, fingers crossed if we can get in. But 2036 is definitely something which we're eyeing. And who knows, if we start building some of our academies now, it might be a step too soon or a step too far, let's just say, to get players onto the platform. But it's certainly something that we want to do here and we're aiming for. And we're quite optimistic, they get a home Olympics and having some Indians competing at that, given India's very strong track record in doubles racket sports. It's something that all eyes are on from our perspective in the paddle community here. And that's something that we want to work towards.
And everyone's touched upon the racket pedigree that Asia has and how that is a key component of paddle's growth. For me, again, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because I wanted to explore whether the fact that these countries have a rich pedigree in table tennis or badminton or squash or even tennis, does that mean that there is a pipeline of players who can be easily converted to paddle? Or do you think that actually it means that the landscape and the market that paddle is going into is already very competitive and very saturated with a lot of very similar sports? And I think the one thing that caught my eye, and Curtis, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is I saw a front office sports news article relatively recently where China apparently had officially declared that by 2029, they wanted pickleball to become almost like their next national sport. And to back that up, they were going to build 10,000 courts, and they were looking to achieve 100 million players playing pickleball, because they saw it as something similar to table tennis in the sense that it's something that's really good for all age groups to stay healthy, stay nimble mentally. And they think pickleball is a nice evolution of that, or a nice parallel to that. So they are, it seems based on this story, really doubling down on pickleball. And we spoke about pickleball's accessibility, right? It's much cheaper. The infrastructure costs are much lower. It's actually in some ways easier for very young and very old people to play, because it's less intense on the joints and on the body. Is that old pedigree a blessing or a curse? And is pickleball a real threat to paddle? Because they're both kind of coming into Asia at the same time. They offer something very similar, but also something very different. And is there going to be a choice being made by a lot of consumers about which fork in the road they're going to take with these new sports?
In terms of pickleball, a lot of our players actually play both pickleball and paddle. So for pickleball, they think it's less competitive compared to paddle. So obviously, both sports draws a lot of similarities, and inevitably, it is also competing in a way. So it really comes in the legitimacy of the sport, whether it has Olympic status, East Asian Games status, Asian Games status. And that's very important for like players or the grassroots people, like kids and their parents, to choose which sport to go to. They will definitely choose a sport that's legitimate. There's a good forecast to it, for example, swimming or tennis. So that's why we have to make it to the Olympics in order to attract more people to play. And at the very early stage, I would say it's still more recreational. We have to target like specific niche segment first, and then we go into the mass audience. That would be the strategy. And obviously in Hong Kong or in China, badminton, table tennis, and even tennis is a very well-known sport to the Hong Kong and China citizen. So it's very difficult to convert them, but we have to start somewhere. So our starting point to actually gain popularity would be the expats in Hong Kong and the expats in Shanghai. And I've spoken to a lot of metropolitan city players, Chengdu or Shanghai. They actually attract expats first, and then slowly gaining more traction into the local market. And a fun fact is we opened our doors in last October. It was literally like we're in an expat country. Like most people are white expats. And I would say 90% expats, 10% local Chinese. And as we did the collaboration with Swire, the ratio actually changed a bit to around 60-40. So there's a shift in our customer demographics, which I'm happy to see, because it shows that the local citizens are accepting the sport and it is growing. So hopefully these events and more investments into the sport, and hopefully we will have a very strong local Hong Kong team. Because as you might have known, a lot of our sports like rugby, the players are expats, are white. So hopefully we'll be able to field a local Hong Kong Chinese team for the HPPC, for example.
One last question from my side. We talked earlier a little bit about the pop-up paddle court idea to help promote clubs, obviously, or promote the sport in certain cities, and putting those courts in unusual, unconventional places where people wouldn't expect to see paddle. What about ahead of calendar events coming from Premier Padel or Hexagon Cup official event? What about kind of promotional events that are just going to help get the players into the Asian market? Is that something that's going to really help transform the sport's potential in terms of generating interest and getting people on the court, getting people becoming fans of the top players as well? Is that something that would help in India as well, alongside the building of the courts and the push at the recreational level?
Yeah, definitely. Hosting some of that big events here, showcasing the sport to the nation, really. is something that could really elevate it up another level. Whether the time is now, I think this sport really needs to develop a little bit more before the likes of a Premier Padel or an A1 or so comes across this way. There's no doubt that you can make a lot of noise around that, really promote the event. You can have more celebrities come down, and that will gain a lot of traction for more eyeballs on the sport. So that's definitely something that we would like to do going forward. Now there's the mini version of it, which is the APPT, which I think Curtis has hosted recently. For now, that's kind of gathering momentum across the region. It's going into different cities, lots of players, it's accumulating more players, and there's over 500 players or so played on it now. Getting that to India as a starting point and using that as laying the foundations for some of the bigger major tournaments that come across, and really getting the media involved. Because once it goes on to the TV, that's when you're getting hundreds of millions of eyeballs. And that's what we really want for the sport to go more mainstream.
Curtis, is it the same for you? Are you much more focused on the APPT, APPC tier of hero building? Or are you trying to go for Premier Padel or Pro-Ams that bring across Galan and Sands and Jose Maria, the big international players? What is the sweet spot for your markets to really help Asia fall in love with the game at the pro level, at the top level?
I may speak about Singapore itself, and what I'm aware of is that the government is currently eyeing a lot on bringing more and more major sports event into Singapore. Obviously, we have every year the Grand Prix. And I think after COVID, the Singapore government has really been trying to kind of catch up over those few years. And there's a lot of funds that's been injected in also building the facilities and ramping up the capacity so that they can actually host those major events. We also had like major concerts, Taylor Swift and Coldplay, for example, earlier this year. So I think we are heading towards that. If you're asking me whether in the next 2 years, for example, we should or we would have a Premier Padel event in Singapore, I would say it would still be a little bit early, because for people to actually spend time and potentially buy tickets to go and watch such event, they would have to be able to first and foremost pick up the sport themselves. You would typically go and watch a sport that you actually play yourself. And I think we're not there yet. The number of clubs are obviously growing and the number of courts as well. So what I can foresee is that maybe within the next 4 or 5 years, I think it would be possible to have a Premier Padel event here as we get more clubs coming up, and of course, many more people playing, many more kids, in fact, playing. All these clubs, including ours, will have, or in fact should have, academies with top coaches so that the kids can really pick up the sport, love it. And when they love a sport, they will ask the parents to take them to watch Premier Padel. And they may obviously eventually know Galan and those folks. I think we are not there yet. I think the other thing that will really help us to have such event in the future would be, again, back to the federation point. If we're able to have a official federation that is sanctioned by the government, possibly there would be more funds allocated to that sport itself by the government. And thanks to that, we would then afford, I would say, to have a Premier Padel event in town. So it's a whole ecosystem that we need to build first before we are capable of hosting a Premier Padel event, which will be attended by sufficient number of people.
I completely agree with what Davey said. We got to build a strong fan base first before hosting a mega event like Premier Padel. And another thing I would add would be hosting other FIP tournaments like FIP Rise, FIP Promotion would help as well, because their level is far greater than like local Hong Kong players already. So being able to watch them play at a lower cost, like hosting costs, or they do not have to buy tickets to watch it, would be also very beneficial. And having an association is very important as well, and hosting these FIP tournaments. In terms of Galan, like LeBron, like those paddle superstars, I think local heroes are more important. Like, for example, seeing Siobhan, who's the bronze medalist at the Olympics, or like Vivian, who's the gold medalist in fencing in Hong Kong, seeing them play, I think it will have more impact than seeing Galan play in Hong Kong, because their popularity in Hong Kong is already there. And so I believe it will be more beneficial to grow the sport.
What I kind of want to head towards as we wrap up, for me, the two major questions, and they're connected, is the first question for me is, what are the big roadblocks that still exist in your markets or in the Asian region that are stopping that growth? We talked a lot about the things that can help with the growth, but there are surely roadblocks or obstacles that exist that in an ideal world, we would snap our fingers and they would disappear, and that would really help things. So I'd really love to get an understanding of roadblocks. And I guess the link to the second or even the last big question is, for listeners who are tuning into this podcast from around the world and who are thinking about opportunities and markets to explore, what do you think are the opportunities for people who are outside of Asia to support what you guys are trying to do in your respective markets or in Asia more generally? What can any business or stakeholder in Padel globally do to help the Asian market grow and be part of that growth story? So if we start off with the obstacles and then move on to the opportunities for external value drivers, how would we address that? Maybe, Alan, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think that some of the obstacles are probably shared by the guys. Coaching being a big bottleneck, having good quality coaches out here, that's probably shared by every country. The cost for courts, which is now hopefully being solved once we get a bit of operating leverage and the onshoring of manufacturing, hopefully that will make it easier and more affordable to set up clubs. The same with products. So importing products, also very expensive. There's a lot of customs duties here. I think in time we'll have the onshoring. In fact, there's one or two local manufacturers who have started alongside Decathlon introducing more affordable rackets and products. I think to Davy's point on the federation side of things, if we could just have some clarity on that, that then enables you to have a structure in place from coaching, from tournaments, from everything else. It gives the whole ecosystem, like I said, the plan to work towards. So there's some of the bottlenecks that, we have experienced here, including in that is when you're shipping, like many shipping delays, of course, coming across, problems with the Red Sea, this and that. But yeah, I'll pass the mic on to the guys to see if they want to add anything.
Okay, I think obviously we have touched on it many times already. We need to have more official federations to structure the whole Padel ecosystem. I'm also aware of certain tennis federations which are also keen to take over Padel. And I guess I wouldn't say that it's an absolute no, but I would also like to really understand under what terms and conditions, if I may say that very bluntly, because it's not just about taking over, it's also what you intend to do with the sport of Padel. And I can see a lot of synergies, but I can also see some danger to that. One thing that's actually really critical is the weather in Asia. I think typically in Europe, especially in the northern part of Europe, I think Alex, it may resonate, and same for Ben in the context of UK. In the winter, we know that you can't play Padel. It's just too cold. The weather is just not possible. So it's a no-brainer for the governments to say, okay, I know that it's not that easy to find like those warehouses, but we know that Padel has to be played indoor and under sheltered facilities. I think that's very clear. In Asia, typically, I would say India or Southeast Asia and even Hong Kong, it's actually warm all year long. So technically, nothing stops you from playing outdoor. But the amount of rainfall in Southeast Asia, for example, it's just crazy. At Pop Padel, we will be fortunate enough to have a roof that's authorized by the government. So we got the permit to build a roof. But I'm also aware that not all clubs have that luxury yet. And for the government to actually grant those kind of permits to build sheltered facilities, it's actually very challenging. And the government is just feeling that you don't need a roof because the weather is warm enough for you to be playing right under the sky. But the amount of rain is something that really may be a huge hindrance to the sustainability and viability of a Padel club from the business standpoint. So getting, again, sheltered courts is a must. And I think this is where we should try to all aim towards. One of the other obstacles I would say is that in Asia, you have, especially in the higher density cities, you have a scarcity of land. That's why in places like Bali or Phuket, though they were able to build many courts because I guess the amount of available land is a lot more than in very high density cities like Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Jakarta, or Hong Kong, Shanghai, Shenzhen, all those. So the availability of land will be a constraint, but again, the height requirement in paddle is also an obstacle that typically pickleball wouldn't have. And since I'm talking about pickleball, I will end on that. I think this is also one possible obstacle, as much as some people see synergies as well. But in Singapore, definitely people are very big on pickleball because it's easier and easier to install courts as well. So in Southeast Asia, at least, I would say that the population is generally younger maybe than in the northern part of Asia. So I do see that still the chances of them playing paddle more than pickleball will be high. But yeah, it's definitely something to keep on the radar.
Curtis, any other obstacles that you highlight?
Yeah, so for Hong Kong and China as well, the government is very strict on the land use. Even if you have a piece of land, if the land use is not recreational use, you cannot build anything on it. So the government policy has to be aligned with the development of the sport, because we've seen a lot of prosecutions because of the land use in Hong Kong. Even investors are wary about it, so there aren't a lot of investments into it. I believe the government policy can change a bit, but it's also an egg and a chicken problem, whichever comes first. Like the investment comes first, or whether you see a significant result comes first. For example, Hong Kong has had really good results in fencing. And then 2 years after the Tokyo Olympics, there's a fencing stadium built. So in Hong Kong, like it's very result oriented. So we will have to be fortunate to gain some results for the government to see in order for them to invest into it. Another way out would be investments from like private companies, developers, which we are in talks with. So there's also opportunity there. So it's not all obstacles. There are opportunities within it.
Just to wrap up, guys, we're running a bit late, but I'd love to get your feelings about what global stakeholders and contributors to the paddle ecosystem can contribute to Asia. What are the opportunities where they can come and meaningfully, incredibly help the journey and the trajectories that you guys are trying to drive in your respective markets or in Asia more generally? Davy, should we start with you?
Yeah, sure. As my peers here mentioned already, definitely coaching. We need good coaches here. We also not only need good coaches here, but we also need to have some programs to train up whoever is aspiring to become a paddle coach. For example, existing local tennis coaches here who just want to add one more skill set to their resume and to become a paddle coach in view of the upcoming growth in the demand. So definitely we're open to seeing more coaches, more academies, those sort of international academies to consider Asia as being one of the next really big market for them. I think that's one. We mentioned about hosting at some point some major tournaments. And like Curtis said, it doesn't have to be those superstars. In fact, last year in Thailand, in Phuket, there was the first FIP tournament, FIP promotion. And when you watch the level, it's just insane. It's way enough for the people to be impressed and to say, hey, maybe I want to play this very, very spectacular sport. So getting more of those international organizations to come and host tournaments here would be great. And then I think the other opportunities that I can see in the Asian market will be the manufacturing of courts, distribution of paddle courts, as well as the manufacturing and distribution of paddle equipment, racket. One key aspect also, I think, is the technology part. We haven't touched on that, but all the booking apps, all the cameras, there's just so much that can be done around the paddle ecosystem when it comes to technology. In the region here, in India, in Philippines, we have massive pool of talents, IT experts, coders, developers, who would be surely be very helpful for whatever is technology related for paddle.
What are your final thoughts about the opportunities for the global support of the Asian journey?
Yep. As Davey and Alan said, coaching is very important. And one interesting point that came up to mind is coaching like certificate standard. I come from a soccer background. Football coaches have their FIFA certificate, like coaching certificate. I think it might be interesting for FIP to introduce something like that. So coaches are certified and at least we would know the standard or like the quality of the coach. So that would be beneficial for the Asian market, I believe.
And Alan, wrap it up. What do you think is the key to people coming in and meaningfully and credibly helping?
Yeah, I mean, as the guys have really touched on it there. I mean, there's a huge opportunity to come in here for any of the Spanish companies, for example, on the core manufacturing, and use India as a beachhead to export to the wider region. There's huge export subsidies. So that, I think, is a wide space that could be tapped. And then the same then, I mean, on the racket side of things, but also more broadly in the whole apparel side of things. So if any of your listeners have apparel brands or tennis-related brands on the retail side of things that they would like to team up, get into the market, maybe sponsor some events or have some local distributors on the ground, I'm very happy to have that conversation and help the brands out. And then again, with events, we like to have Hexagon or any of the other names that we mentioned, the APPT or other events companies coming in here, building up the sport. There is a huge opportunity. We touched on pickleball. In 10 days, there's a monsoon pickleball championship happening in Mumbai, which is $100,000 in prize win. So huge event. That's a headline number. So if we can replicate that on the paddle side of things, or even get close to it somehow, that could be a big winner, a big opportunity for somebody to come in and develop a tournament IP. So yeah, I think they're the major opportunities that are available at the moment.
Well, gentlemen, that kind of pretty much wraps up our episode. I think we're probably going to have to do future episodes to break down into a bit more detail some of the areas that we touched on. But again, please like, share, and subscribe if the content was thought-provoking. Please comment on LinkedIn or Twitter if you've got any recommendations around our format, topics we should devote an episode to, questions we should ask, speakers we need to bring on. We want you all, those driving the next phase of the industry's future, to tell us what you want to hear about and who from. So for now, thank you, Curtis, Davy, and Alan for joining us today. Thank you, of course, Ben, for helping me steer the conversation from the Hexagon Cup. We will keep doing our best to cover all the angles of the business around paddle, episode after episode. Until the next one, thank you.